I still remember the morning he left for that so-called business trip. The lobby smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink, the usual perfume of our finance department. He strutted past my desk with his suitcase, a sleek black Samsonite that looked far too new for someone claiming to travel every quarter. His tie was loose, his smile smug, and his goodbye was short. "Keep the department running while I'm gone. Jenna, you're the only one I trust." It was the kind of flattery that used to work on me. Not anymore. I had been in corporate finance long enough to know that when someone overemphasizes trust, it's usually because they've already broken it. And with David, our CFO, I'd been noticing the cracks for months. Unexplained reimbursements, double approvals in the expense logs, and mysteriously lost vendor invoices that somehow reappeared right after quarterly reports closed. Still, that morning I forced a polite nod. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. But something about that trip gnawed at me. He said he was going to San Diego for partnership meetings, except none of our active clients or partners were based there. I knew our vendor map by heart. It was literally my job to approve all contracts and filings. And yet, when I checked the travel authorization form, the details were oddly vague. No meeting agenda, no client names, just partnership expansion, Q2. Corporate finance thrives on details. And when details disappear, that's where the truth hides. By the third day of his trip, my instincts turned into suspicion. The expense tracker pinged my inbox. Early reimbursement requests, all pre-approved by him before he'd even returned. Hotel, wedding 450, flights 1 in 200, client dinners 2,700. The numbers weren't shocking. The timing was. None of those receipts had verification attachments. No itinerary, no itemized bills, no signatures from meeting attendees. Just bold amounts, clean and confident, like he assumed no one would dare question them. I decided to check the company travel ledger, a routine process that every finance officer knew could sink or save careers. But as I opened the digital folder, a strange chill crept over me. The entry for San Diego Q2 trip wasn't stored under the standard travel record structure. Instead, it was tucked inside a folder labeled Reimbursements Pending, Legacy. That folder was meant for trips from 2 years ago. My hand froze on the mouse. Either he'd uploaded to the wrong directory, or he didn't want it found easily. Curiosity pushed me further. I opened the receipts one by one, zooming in on every logo, every line item. And that's when I noticed it. The same font, the same receipt template, the same timestamp pattern repeating on every image. He hadn't just falsified expenses. He'd manufactured an entire paper trail. The restaurant listed on the $2,700 dinner, it had been permanently closed for over a year. The hotel in La Jolla, a wellness spa that didn't even offer overnight stays. And the flight confirmation code, a recycled number format from an internal mock audit form. One I had designed last year for training exercises. He'd used my own system to create his cover-up. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding in quiet disbelief. The total fraudulent claim was small enough to slip under radar. Maybe 10,000, maybe 15,000. But the pattern was dangerous. It hinted at something systemic. A person like David didn't fake one trip. He built an entire illusion of them, enough to drain hundreds of thousands slowly, quietly, beneath layers of compliant paperwork and false trust. That night, I sat alone in the office, lights dimmed, rain tapping against the tall windows like nervous fingers. I pulled every travel log from the last 3 years, sorted by approver. The list was long, painfully long, but one name appeared in bold across each. David S. Lang, Chief Financial Officer. And then I saw the total. $210,000 in executive reimbursements over a 36-month period, all marked as verified, all without traceable receipts. A slow exhale escaped me. My boss, the man who built his reputation on fiscal discipline and integrity metrics, had just exposed his own empire of deceit. But exposure wasn't enough. Not yet. Because in our company, accusations without evidence were career suicide, and David knew that better than anyone. He'd built his fortress on procedural immunity. Layered approvals, overlapping digital signatures, and coded ledgers only senior executives could access. If I wanted to bring him down, I needed more than suspicion. I needed something that would pierce through the bureaucracy, a legal, undeniable, irreversible proof. So I started digging, quietly, methodically, and as the pieces began to fit together, I realized something chilling. He hadn't just stolen from the company. He'd designed a loophole to keep everyone else from finding out, and I was the only one left who could close it. By the next morning, the office felt heavier, like the walls themselves knew something they weren't supposed to. I came in early, coffee in hand, eyes set on my monitor. On the surface, everything looked normal. Morning emails, vendor approvals, payroll reports. But behind the spreadsheets, behind the quiet hum of keyboards and fake smiles, I saw it. The rhythm of deceit that had gone unnoticed for years. David had built a system that was too perfect to question. Every transaction passed through 3 verification layers: department approval, finance confirmation, and executive oversight. And since he managed the last 2, no one ever cross-checked his own claims. It was a self-sustaining loop, a fraud machine disguised as compliance. I began where any good auditor would: timelines. If his travel records were fake, the accounting timestamps wouldn't align with our system logs, so I traced each trip against company-wide VPN access. Our servers recorded every login, every remote connection, and David's digital trail told a different story entirely. While his receipts placed him in San Diego, his login history showed him working from his home IP address, right here in the city. Not just once, every single trip. My heart raced as I compared dates, building a silent map of his lies. He'd been charging flights he never took, hotel stays that never happened, and client meetings that existed only in the realm of invoices and imagination. I didn't breathe a word to anyone. In a corporate ecosystem like ours, one rumor could destroy your career faster than any scandal, and David was loved by the board. Charming, confident, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and congratulated interns on their first week. He had spent years cultivating that trust. I couldn't afford to lose mine. So I created what I called a shadow ledger. It was a parallel record, hidden, encrypted, only accessible through an offline flash drive. Every night, after everyone had left, I copied one new piece of data. Approval forms, timestamps, fake receipts, payment authorizations, and matching bank disbursement records. 3 weeks in, the pattern became undeniable. The fraud wasn't random. It was scheduled. Every quarter, 2 weeks before reporting deadlines, he'd submit 3 or 4 travel reimbursements to create a pretext for temporary liquidity dips. It made the department's operational costs look balanced, when in truth, he was quietly siphoning cash from operational reserves. I'd seen plenty of corporate deceit in my years as a financial analyst, but this was different. This was a CFO turning compliance into camouflage. Still, there was one thing I couldn't figure out: where the money was going. Our reimbursement system was digital, connected to corporate banking. It couldn't just vanish into thin air, unless it was being rerouted. So I traced one transfer through the payment logs. The destination account wasn't an individual. It was a shell vendor, something called Blue Peak Consulting LLC. It was registered in Delaware, the corporate world's favorite hiding place. The name didn't exist in our vendor registry, but the file metadata revealed something stunning. The vendor was added manually 6 months ago, approved only by David himself, a private vendor, controlled, untraceable. That's when I understood his game. He wasn't just stealing, he was laundering. Creating fake business trips to justify payments to a consulting firm that only existed on paper. And the genius of it? He'd buried the paper trail under legitimate vendor renewals, small, routine updates that no one ever audited because they appeared normal. I sat back, staring at the glow of my screen, adrenaline fighting with dread. I had enough to raise questions, but not enough to make it stick. He'd anticipate every move, deny, deflect, discredit. I needed a method that even he couldn't manipulate. That's when I remembered the compliance loophole, a forgotten clause in our internal audit protocol that allowed anonymous irregularity, reports to the board's financial ethics committee, bypassing the CFO's oversight entirely. He'd helped write that clause himself years ago, bragging about how it protected transparency. The irony made me smile. All I had to do was build my case carefully. Evidence that spoke for itself. Irrefutable, time-stamped, and sealed within the very systems he thought he owned. He had created his fortress through paperwork. And now, I was going to make that paperwork turn on him. The next week was a quiet war. I'd perfected the art of pretending. The polite nods, the fake smiles, the small talk about quarterly targets while I built a silent case beneath the surface. Every time David walked past my desk, I felt the weight of what I knew pressing against the back of my throat. He had no idea that his empire of signatures and falsified receipts was already unraveling. The key was the ledger, the invisible one he thought no one would dare question. He'd hidden his fake vendor under a stack of legitimate ones, blending Blue Peak Consulting between actual partners like Continental Analytics and North Shore Procurement. But unlike those, Blue Peak had no tax ID verification. That was my way in. I drafted an internal audit request, citing data integrity cross-verification, and scheduled it as part of the monthly review cycle. To everyone else, it looked like routine compliance work, but beneath the official request, I embedded specific parameters, ones that would isolate vendor accounts missing verification metadata. It was subtle, undetectable, and completely within my authority. When the results came in, my heart almost stopped. Blue Peak wasn't alone. There were 3 other ghost vendors linked through similar payment trails, all funneled through the same corporate banking subnet, all marked as confidential vendor relations, and all approved by David, $210,000 total. Every cent matched the reimbursement totals I'd already found. The man hadn't faked a single business trip. He'd built an entire parallel economy under our roof. But exposure wasn't as simple as pressing send. Corporate fraud at this level required precision, one misstep, and I'd look like the aggressor. David's influence ran deep. He could turn a board meeting into a witch hunt if he sensed a threat. So I created a 3-tier documentation chain: the raw evidence, receipts, approval logs, and bank traces; the procedural chain, proof that every file followed company protocol, leaving no room for tampering accusations; the legal layer, every clause of the financial ethics code he'd violated, cross-referenced by date and section. It took 2 sleepless nights, but by the end my evidence wasn't just airtight, it was bulletproof. Still, something felt unfinished. I had evidence, yes, but no trigger. Something that would force the board to act publicly before he could silence it. That's when fate intervened. An email landed in my inbox. Quarterly compliance presentation, prepared by CFO, scheduled for Friday. David was going to present the department's financial health to the entire executive board. The opportunity was too perfect. I realized I didn't need to expose him myself. I could let him expose himself. All I needed to do was feed the system, carefully upload one missing piece, a single receipt that proved the San Diego trip hotel didn't exist, but had still been reimbursed. Then, when the financial presentation drew data from the master ledger, his own slide deck would show the inconsistency live, in front of everyone. The system would flag it automatically. The board would question it instantly, and I'd be ready, with every document, every proof, every timestamp, waiting in silence for the moment his world came crashing down. The loophole he'd built to protect himself would be the same one that destroyed him, and I was counting the hours. Friday arrived like a loaded gun. The boardroom was dressed in its usual power: glass walls, polished mahogany, screens glowing with graphs that told sanitized stories of success. David stood at the head of the table, confident as ever, a navy suit that screamed authority, and a tone that wrapped deception in charm. I sat near the end, pretending to be absorbed in my notes, though every nerve in my body was wired to the tension humming in that room. He began smoothly, walking the board through quarterly growth figures. Numbers flowed effortlessly from his lips, controlled, rehearsed, beautiful lies wrapped in corporate poetry. The finance department has streamlined vendor operations by 14% this quarter, he said proudly. Our travel expenses remain stable with all executive trips verified and compliant. That last line nearly made me laugh. Verified and compliant. If only he knew what was coming. Behind the scenes, I'd already prepared the trigger. I'd embedded the real receipt file, the one showing that the supposed San Diego hotel didn't exist, directly into the ledger system that fed the presentation's live data. It wasn't a hack. It was simply truth, placed where it belonged. As his slides transitioned, the system cross-checked each financial record in real time. And then, mid-sentence, it happened. A small red notification blinked in the corner of the display. Data verification error. Reimbursement mismatch detected. The room went still. David frowned, clicking rapidly through his slides, trying to recover the flow. Minor system sync, he said lightly. It's been updating the compliance filters. But the board's chair, Mrs. Langford, wasn't someone you could bluff. Hold on, she said, leaning forward. What's the mismatch? He hesitated. Just a travel entry, routine. Show it, she ordered. I watched his eyes flicker. He tried to move to the next slide, but the system froze, compliance mode activated. The red text expanded on screen, revealing the entry. San Diego Partnership Expansion, Q2. Vendor, Blue Peak Consulting. Receipt validation failed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mrs. Langford's voice sharpened. Blue Peak Consulting, I don't recall that name on our approved vendor list. I felt my pulse hammering. This was the moment. He looked around the table, calculating, sweating just beneath his polished demeanor. It's a minor partner. Temporary contract for market assessment, he said. Everything's documented, except it wasn't, because right then, the automated ledger system displayed the final line in gray text, a note I had tagged for audit visibility only. Vendor verification file not found. The words hit like thunder. David's mask cracked for the briefest second, a flicker of panic he tried to bury under a forced smile. This is clearly an internal error, he stammered. Our finance analyst must have... I didn't let him finish. Actually, I said softly, I double-checked the vendor files myself. Blue Peak doesn't exist. Every head turned toward me. He froze. The color drained from his face. Excuse me? The EIN number attached to Blue Peak is inactive, I continued, keeping my tone calm, measured. The address listed leads to a mail forwarding center in Delaware, and the so-called hotel receipts came from a business that closed over a year ago. For a long, tense second, the only sound in the room was the projector fan. Then Mrs. Langford leaned back slowly. David? Is there anything you'd like to explain? He opened his mouth, but no words came. His confidence had finally met something it couldn't charm. Evidence. I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because the boardroom, once his stage, was now his trap, and I had just pulled the trigger. The meeting ended in chaos. David tried to regain control, muttering about system corruption, demanding IT to run diagnostics, but the board wasn't listening anymore. Eyes that once sparkled with admiration were now filled with suspicion. The moment the room emptied, I quietly collected my documents, plugged in my encrypted drive, and left before anyone could ask questions. My plan had only just begun, because exposure wasn't enough. I wanted accountability. Over the weekend, I drafted a formal report to the Corporate Ethics Committee, detailing every fraudulent reimbursement, every forged signature, and every fabricated vendor. I didn't accuse, I demonstrated. Each section followed corporate policy, annotated with the same legal precision David had once used to hide his crimes. The most powerful thing about revenge isn't anger. It's accuracy. By Monday, my report was in motion. The committee launched what they called a full procedural audit. What they didn't realize was that every breadcrumb they would find had already been placed there, by me. I had built the trail, layered and chronological, so every step they took would lead exactly where I wanted them. To him. For the first time in his career, David couldn't control the narrative. The board froze all his approvals, IT restricted his system access, and HR issued a confidential suspension notice pending investigation. But I wasn't done. I quietly contacted our legal compliance partner, the same firm that handled executive certifications. I shared one detail that sealed his fate. Blue Peak's corporate registration matched the initials of his wife's personal holding company. That link wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. By the time the investigators uncovered it themselves, David's downfall was inevitable. 3 weeks later, the internal audit report landed on every board member's desk. The title was simple: Findings on Unauthorized Vendor and Travel Expense Misconduct. Total liability, $210,000. In the summary, one line stood out like a scar. Evidence suggests deliberate misrepresentation of travel expenses for personal financial gain. He had nowhere left to hide. I watched from the glass corridor as he was escorted out one afternoon, the same suitcase in his hand, the same smugness gone from his face. No words, no farewell speech, no smile, just silence and humiliation. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about integrity. The thing he'd mocked every time he signed a fake approval. And now, the paperwork he'd used to build his power had become the very chain that dragged him down. The day of David's disciplinary hearing arrived quietly, but the tension was loud. No one spoke in the corridors. Even the printers seemed to hum more softly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Rumors had spread like static through every department. The CFO under investigation, the books under audit, the empire cracking from the top down. I sat outside the glass conference room, a folder in my lap, pretending to review documents I'd already memorized. Inside, the board members whispered in tight circles, while corporate counsel flipped through binders of evidence that I'd built piece by piece. David walked in late. His eyes were red, his posture defensive, the perfect picture of a man who'd realized his control had expired. He didn't look at me, not once. That silence between us was heavier than any accusation. When the meeting began, he spoke first. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We've had issues with internal systems for months. My expense records must have been tampered with." Classic deflection, but the board wasn't fooled anymore. Mrs. Langford folded her arms. "David, the system shows consistent approval patterns linked to your credentials across multiple fiscal quarters. Are you suggesting someone forged your own access keys?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The pause said more than his words ever could. That was when the forensic auditor, a quiet woman named Marla, opened a folder and slid a printed sheet across the table. "We also traced the Blue Peak Consulting Bank account," she said calmly. "Funds were deposited into an entity registered under Lang Consulting Holdings, your wife's company." The room fell silent. David's hands trembled. His carefully constructed facade began to splinter. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It was temporary. Just a stopgap until bonuses cleared." "Stopgap?" Langford repeated coldly. "You routed $210,000 through shell accounts. This isn't creative budgeting, David. It's fraud." He sank back into his chair, pale and shaking. I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. Just a deep, settling calm. The kind that comes when truth stops hiding. By the time the meeting ended, the decision was unanimous. Immediate termination, full repayment proceedings, and a referral to the company's legal division. His access was revoked on the spot. The news hit the company like a storm. Executives scrambled to distance themselves. Employees whispered in disbelief, the man they'd idolized, undone by his own lies. But amidst the chaos, one detail slipped quietly into circulation. The anonymous compliance report that started it all came from someone inside the finance department. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I just went back to my desk, logged into my system, and watched the new notification appear. A full internal audit request of all CFO-approved vendors, this time led by me. For the first time in years, the numbers on our ledgers finally told the truth. As for David, his story ended not with an explosion but with an echo, the hollow sound of his reputation collapsing under its own weight. The man who once claimed to guard the company's integrity was now a cautionary tale, whispered in every training room, cited in every ethics memo. And I stayed silent, watching it all unfold. The storm I had unleashed, the empire I had quietly dismantled with nothing but precision and proof. The applause never came. But it didn't need to. The victory was already written, in the ledgers he once controlled, now corrected under my name. After the storm came the quiet, the kind that feels almost unreal, as if the air itself doesn't know what to do without tension. The week after David's termination, our office felt different. Lighter, somehow. The shadows that used to hang over the finance floor had thinned. People spoke freely again. There was laughter where there used to be hesitation. But I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I'd learned that truth doesn't always need a voice. Sometimes it just needs to exist long enough for people to see it. The board thanked me privately, though my name never appeared in any official document. They framed it as an internal procedural correction, as they always do. Corporate language for we'll fix it quietly and hope no one notices. But I didn't care about recognition. I cared that the books were clean, that the company I'd worked for wasn't just a facade of numbers built on lies. A few days later, HR forwarded a small update to all department heads, a memo confirming the creation of a new compliance oversight program, one that required dual authorization for all executive reimbursements. It was my recommendation, slipped into my final report, and now it was policy. That was my victory. Quiet, invisible, permanent. As for David, the last I heard, the investigation had escalated beyond internal review. His wife's company was under audit. His accounts were frozen. The lavish house in the suburbs he'd bragged about in meetings was reportedly listed for sale. He'd built his power on falsified confidence, but in the end, the paper trail he thought protected him became the noose that tightened around his own name. One evening, as I walked out of the office, I passed by the empty executive parking lot. His reserved space was gone, the brass nameplate removed, just a blank patch of asphalt where arrogance used to stand. I paused there for a moment, not in gloating, but in reflection. I realized revenge doesn't always arrive with fire or fury. Sometimes it's measured in balance sheets, in the calm after corruption collapses, in the quiet restoration of order. I had done what I came to do. The company was cleaner, my conscience lighter. And yet, as the elevator doors closed behind me that night, a single thought lingered. He taught me one truth I'd never forget. That in the world of finance, power isn't about money. It's about who holds the proof, and this time, the proof belonged to me. But as the elevator hummed softly downward, I realized something deeper. Proof only matters if you use it right. It's not just about catching the corrupt, it's about protecting what's still pure. In finance, truth hides in numbers, but integrity hides in people. You can falsify data, edit ledgers, forge signatures, but you can't counterfeit conscience, and that was the part David never understood. He thought paperwork could shield his greed, that signatures were stronger than morality. But the moment I uncovered that falsified trail, it all turned to dust. I didn't destroy him out of anger. I exposed him because silence would have made me his accomplice. And in a world built on trust and transactions, complicity is its own kind of fraud. A few weeks later, when the board announced new audit protocols, dual authorizations, vendor verification, and real-time reporting, they never said my name. They didn't have to. I saw my fingerprints in every line of policy. Quiet justice, written in procedure. Sometimes revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through the rules you rewrite after the storm. That's when I understood. I hadn't just avenged myself. I'd fortified the system he tried to exploit. The real win wasn't watching him fall. It was knowing no one like him could rise the same way again. When I walked out of that building for the last time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The truth had already settled into the walls. Permanent, undeniable, and mine. This is revenge untold, where proof outweighs power, and every secret eventually meets its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.